from one incident. And this is really interesting because this is a Chinese-owned vessel. The United States started its naval blockade eastern. We're around 17 hours.
What if everything you have been told about China's military rise was about to be exposed in the most humiliating 90 minutes in modern naval history? What if the convoy that Beijing sent steaming toward the Strait of Hormuz on the 4th of May 2026 was not a routine commercial movement, not a sanctions evasion run, and not even a diplomatic signal, but a deliberate, calculated attempt to break an American blockade in front of the entire world? Intelligence sources, military analysts, and geopolitical insiders watching the satellite feeds in real time will tell you that what unfolded in the narrowest stretch of water on the planet was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration. A demonstration of what happens when 20 tankers, escorted by the unstated promise of Chinese power, meet 3 American carrier strike groups operating under rules of engagement that nobody outside a very small room in the Pentagon has ever read. Stay with us, because what we are about to lay out for you changes everything you thought you knew about the balance of power in the Persian Gulf. You are watching Briefing Room. We do not chase headlines, we dissect them, and we go where mainstream coverage does not have the patience or the depth to follow. If this is your first time joining us, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is the largest stress test of Chinese maritime power since the founding of the People's Republic, and we are going to walk you through it the way an intelligence officer would walk a cabinet through a morning brief. And to those of you returning, you already know we do not do surface-level reporting here. You know exactly why you are here. Now, to understand why a convoy of 20 tankers carries this much strategic weight, you first need to understand the bigger picture. Because what happened on the 4th of May did not happen in isolation. It happened at the end of a 15-year project that Beijing and Tehran had been quietly constructing in the shadows of the international system. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China built itself a foothold in the Middle East that was specifically designed to bypass American-dominated shipping routes, and the crown jewel of that project was the deep-water port of Chabahar, a logistical gateway carved into the Iranian coast with Chinese capital and Chinese engineering. In return, Iran received exactly what an isolated, sanctioned, revisionist state most desperately needs. It received technology, infrastructure investment, diplomatic cover in the United Nations and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and most importantly, a shadow fleet of tankers whose flagging, ownership, and transponder behavior were deliberately obscured to keep sanctioned Iranian crude flowing into Chinese refineries through years that, on paper, should have economically suffocated the regime in Tehran. This was never a simple commercial relationship. It was a parallel system. A pipeline of oil, money, and strategic protection operating largely outside the reach of Washington's sanctions architecture. China secured discounted energy and a Gulf foothold. Iran secured the revenue and the patron it needed to remain regionally dangerous. And then, on the 13th of April 2026, the United States Navy disassembled that entire architecture in a single operational morning. Karg Island, through which nearly 90% of Iranian crude historically flowed, was sealed. Chabahar, Beijing's prized alternative gateway, was sealed. Bandar Abbas, Iran's main commercial port, was sealed. Every channel that China had been using to extract sanctioned Iranian oil was locked simultaneously, and billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment were stranded in concrete and steel along a coastline that Beijing could no longer access. Think about this carefully, because this is the calculus that produced the convoy. The diplomatic shield that China had spent a decade constructing in international forums became operationally irrelevant overnight, because the problem was no longer being solved with diplomatic notes. The problem was being solved with 3 American carrier strike groups, more than 15 advanced surface combatants, continuous F-35 and FA-18 combat air patrols, P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, and a layer of submarine coverage operating beneath the surface that no Chinese asset in the theater could realistically detect, let alone counter. 190 million barrels of Iranian crude sat loaded in storage with nowhere to go. The lifeline was not strained. It was severed, and this is exactly why what happened on the 4th of May matters so much, because Beijing made a choice. Beijing decided to test whether the blockade was real, and it decided to do so not with 1 tanker and not with 3, but with 20. Here is where it gets critical. The convoy that approached the eastern entrance of the Strait of Hormuz was not, on its face, a military formation. It was, by every public metric, a commercial movement. The vessels were tankers. The flags were a mixture of convenience registries that have become familiar to anyone who tracks the shadow fleet. The cargo manifests, where they existed at all, listed crude oil destined for refineries in Shandong and Zhejiang. But the timing, the spacing, and the simultaneity of the approach told a different story to the analysts watching the AIS data degrade in real time as transponders began to dim, flicker, and in several cases, go dark altogether. This was a probe, and probes, in the language of naval doctrine, are not random. They are designed to test the threshold at which an adversary will actually use force. The lead vessel made its move approximately 20 nautical miles from the American enforcement corridor. It increased speed. It adjusted course. It did not request permission. It did not coordinate with the International Maritime Traffic Control Authority that the U.S. Navy had been routing legitimate civilian shipping through, and it did not respond to the standard hailing procedures that had been broadcast on the appropriate channels for weeks. Behind it, in a loose two-column formation that experienced naval officers will recognize as a classic mass transit configuration, the rest of the convoy followed. 19 more tankers, a combined deadweight tonnage that, if it had reached Chinese ports, would have represented one of the largest single sanctioned crude movements in the history of the trade. What happened next has been described by military analysts in language that is unusually specific for an event whose details remain officially classified. The American response was not a warning shot. It was not a diplomatic protest. It was, according to intelligence assessments now circulating in Allied capitals, a layered, sequenced enforcement action that unfolded across approximately 90 minutes and that resulted in the comprehensive neutralization of the convoy as a coherent operational entity. To be precise, and precision matters here because hype has no place in a serious analysis, sources indicate that the U.S. Navy did not sink 20 Chinese tankers in the conventional sense of shells and torpedoes. What it did was something arguably more devastating in strategic terms. It destroyed the convoy as a functional formation. It crippled its ability to operate as a unit. It paralyzed the political fiction that Beijing had been trying to maintain. The lead tanker was boarded. So was the second. So was the third. Helicopter-borne visit, board, search, and seizure teams, operating under the authority of the Standing Maritime Interdiction Order, descended onto the bridges of multiple vessels in a coordinated tempo. Several tankers, observing what was happening to the lead elements, executed sharp reversals roughly the same 20-minute distance from the line that has now become a kind of unofficial threshold in this crisis. Other vessels were diverted under escort to holding positions where their cargoes could be inventoried. A small number, according to ship tracking data that has since been analyzed by independent open-source researchers, attempted to scatter into Omani territorial waters and were turned back by the Royal Navy of Oman, which has quietly been coordinating with U.S. Fifth Fleet on exactly this kind of contingency. By the time the operational picture stabilized, the convoy, as Beijing had conceived it, no longer existed. Some ships were under American control. Some were retreating eastward. Some were drifting under engineering casualties that may or may not have been the result of cyber actions that no government has yet acknowledged. And the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the force that Beijing has spent 2 decades building into what its own white papers describe as a blue water peer competitor to the United States, was not present in the theater in any operationally relevant capacity. There were no planned destroyers off Muscat. There were no Chinese submarines tracked into the Gulf of Oman. The escort that the convoy implicitly relied upon, the deterrent presence that was supposed to make the United States think twice, did not materialize. And that absence is the single most important strategic data point of the entire incident. Now let us get into what this actually reveals, because the operational story is only the surface, and we owe you the deeper layer. The doctrine that the United States executed in the Strait of Hormuz on the 4th of May is not new. It is, in fact, one of the oldest and most rigorously studied concepts in naval warfare. It is called supply chain degradation, and it operates on the principle that you do not need to defeat your adversary's military to defeat your adversary. You need only to sever the logistical arteries that allow your adversary's economy and political system to function. The British perfected this doctrine against Napoleonic France. The United States perfected it against Imperial Japan in the Pacific Submarine Campaign of 1944 and 1945, when American submarines sank so much Japanese merchant tonnage that the home islands were effectively starved of oil and raw materials before a single Marine landed on Okinawa. During the Korean War, the same principle was applied against North Korean and Chinese supply corridors, and during the Cold War, it was the foundational logic behind every NATO maritime exercise, from the GI-UK Gap to the Mediterranean. What is new, and what makes the events of the 4th of May genuinely historic, is that this doctrine has now been applied not against a wartime adversary in a declared conflict, but against the commercial maritime traffic of a peer competitor in peacetime. The legal framework is sanctions enforcement. The operational framework is blockade, the strategic effect is the same. And Beijing, for the first time since the founding of the People's Republic, has been forced to confront what it actually means to be on the receiving end of American command of the sea in a theater where Washington holds overwhelming local advantage. The international dimension of this is where the picture becomes genuinely complex, and where diplomatic ambiguity is itself a signal worth reading carefully. The Russian Foreign Ministry, which would ordinarily be expected to issue a thunderous denunciation of any American maritime enforcement action involving Chinese vessels, has been notably restrained. The official statement, when it finally arrived, called for de-escalation and dialogue, language that diplomats use when they do not wish to be associated too closely with a partner whose miscalculation has just been exposed. Moscow, which is fighting its own war and depends on Chinese economic support, has no interest in being dragged into a Gulf confrontation on the losing side of an embarrassment. The silence is the message. Within China itself, state media coverage of the incident has been carefully managed. The Defense Ministry spokesman, Admiral Dong Jun, delivered remarks that were strong in tone, asserting that Chinese vessels have the right to transit international waters, and that the United States should not interfere in legitimate Chinese commerce. Yet not a single sentence in those remarks committed the People's Liberation Army Navy to any specific protective action, and not a single tanker in the convoy was actually shielded by those words. The gap between Beijing's public rhetoric and its operational behavior is now visible to every navy, every intelligence service, and every government on the planet that has been paying attention. And that gap is precisely where the most dangerous calculation of this entire crisis now lives. The European response has been characteristically fragmented. The United Kingdom continues to focus on mine clearance and humanitarian navigation, declining to associate itself directly with the blockade enforcement line. France is conducting its own independent operations, maintaining the Gaullist tradition of strategic autonomy. Germany and Australia have stayed almost entirely out of the theater. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have offered logistical support without committing combat assets. In effect, the United States is conducting the most consequential naval operation of the 21st century largely alone, and that fact is itself a significant strategic data point about the actual coalition geometry of the current international system. Now we have to talk about the psychological layer, because this is where the analysis goes from operational to civilizational. For the Chinese public, and more importantly for the Chinese Communist Party's domestic legitimacy, the events of the 4th of May represent something genuinely difficult to absorb. For more than 2 decades, the implicit bargain between the party and the Chinese population has been continuous economic growth, rising living standards, and the steady restoration of national dignity after what every Chinese schoolchild is taught to call the century of humiliation. The promise embedded in that bargain was that China would never again be a country whose ships could be turned back by foreign navies, that its merchant fleet would sail under the protection of a navy capable of defending it anywhere in the world, that the era of gunboat diplomacy practiced against China was permanently closed. 20 tankers turning back, or being boarded, or being scattered in the Gulf of Oman is not consistent with that promise, and the party knows it. Which is why the domestic information environment around this incident is being managed with a level of care that, in itself, tells you how serious the political stakes are inside Zhongnanhai. There is also a psychological dimension on the American side that is worth naming honestly. The United States Navy has not conducted a maritime interdiction operation of this scale and visibility since the closing months of the Second World War. An entire generation of American naval officers has trained for this kind of operation in simulators and tabletop exercises, but has never executed it under live conditions against the commercial fleet of a peer competitor. The fact that it was executed, by all available accounts, with professionalism, restraint, and without loss of life, is itself a quiet vindication of decades of doctrinal investment. The image of American helicopters descending onto Chinese-linked tanker decks in the world's most strategically critical waterway is going to circulate in defense ministries and naval academies from Tokyo to New Delhi to Canberra for years. The question that everyone is asking now is whether the blockade itself was the weapon, or whether the events of the 4th of May were the weapon. And this is where we have to be honest with you about the limits of what can be confirmed in public sources. Intelligence assessments suggest that the convoy was always intended, on the American side, as a moment of demonstration, that the rules of engagement had been pre-authorized at the highest levels, that the Navy was waiting for exactly this kind of probe. Other analysts believe, with equal plausibility, that Beijing was the one performing the demonstration, that the convoy was designed precisely to expose the blockade as either too aggressive to be sustained or too porous to be taken seriously, and that the calculation simply went wrong. The truth, as is so often the case in great power competition, probably lies somewhere in the overlapping space between these two readings. What we can say with confidence is this: the deterrent effect of the events of the 4th of May is now operating in both directions. Beijing has learned, in the most public way possible, that the People's Liberation Army Navy is not yet capable of contesting American sea control in the Persian Gulf. Washington has learned, by having executed the operation, that its blockade architecture works. And the rest of the world, including allies and adversaries alike, has learned that the distance between Chinese rhetoric and Chinese capability in this specific theater is wider than Beijing's diplomats have spent 15 years claiming. What comes next is genuinely uncertain, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. China has options. None of them are good. It can attempt a more serious naval escort, which would mean dispatching PLAN combatants from Djibouti or further afield into a theater where they would be at a severe tactical disadvantage. It can escalate diplomatically through the United Nations Security Council, where its veto provides leverage, but no oil for its refineries. It can accelerate the long-term diversification away from Hormuz through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the port of Gwadar, but those projects cannot replace, on the timescale that matters, the volume that currently moves through the strait. It can absorb the damage, draw down its strategic petroleum reserve, and wait for the political pressure on Washington to mount. Or it can, as the most patient school of analysts believes it will, simply calculate, calculate, and calculate some more, ensuring that its rivals hurt more than it does while the diplomatic clock runs. Here is the question we want to put to you, and we genuinely want to hear your answer. Do you think Beijing will eventually escalate this confrontation by deploying People's Liberation Army Navy combatants to escort the next convoy, or will it continue to absorb the damage and rely on long-term diversification away from the Hormuz choke point? Drop your assessment in the comments below. Your perspective genuinely matters to this conversation, because the readers and viewers of this channel include people whose professional judgment on these questions is among the sharpest in the world, and we read every comment. If this analysis helped you see what is actually happening behind the headlines, sharing this video takes 2 seconds, and it helps us keep bringing you this level of analysis. Hit that like button. Subscribe to World Brief Live and turn on notifications, because the next 24 to 72 hours in the Strait of Hormuz are going to determine whether the events of the 4th of May go down as the moment a great power confrontation was contained, or the moment it began to spiral into something the world has not seen in 3 generations. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is no longer simply a choke point. Hormuz has become the place where the actual balance of power in the 21st century is being measured, one tanker at a time, one enforcement decision at a time, and one day at a time. We will see you in the next briefing. Now let us widen the lens further, because there is a dimension to this confrontation that very few analysts are discussing in public, and it concerns the global insurance and shipping markets that quietly underwrite everything we are describing. Within 48 hours of the events of the 4th of May, the war risk premiums charged by Lloyd's of London syndicates for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz reportedly tripled, and for any tanker with documented links to Chinese ownership or Chinese charter arrangements, several major underwriters quietly suspended coverage altogether. This is not a footnote. This is a structural blow to the economics of the shadow fleet itself, because a tanker that cannot be insured, cannot be financed, cannot be chartered by reputable counterparties, and in many jurisdictions cannot legally enter port. What the United States Navy did with helicopters and boarding teams in the Gulf of Oman, the London insurance market is now reinforcing with actuarial tables and underwriting committees, and the combined effect is a kind of economic blockade layered on top of the physical one. Beijing's shadow fleet was always vulnerable to exactly this pressure, and Washington appears to have timed its enforcement action to maximize that vulnerability. There is also a logistical reality on the Iranian side that deserves to be named because it shapes what comes next in ways that are not immediately obvious. Iran's onshore crude storage capacity is finite, and according to the most recent open-source assessments, that capacity is now approaching saturation. When storage tanks fill, refineries are forced to throttle production at the wellhead, and once wells are throttled in the specific geological conditions of Iranian fields, restarting them at full capacity is neither quick nor cheap. In other words, every additional week the blockade holds is not simply a week of lost revenue for Tehran. It is a week of potential long-term damage to the productive capacity of the Iranian energy sector itself. Intelligence assessments suggest that the regime is acutely aware of this and that the pressure to find a diplomatic exit ramp is now operating on a timescale measured in weeks rather than months. This is where the deterrence calculation becomes genuinely complex, because the side that appears to be winning operationally may also be the side under the greatest political pressure to convert that operational success into a durable settlement before the costs of sustaining it begin to outweigh the benefits. Washington has demonstrated capability. Beijing has absorbed humiliation. Tehran is bleeding revenue. And every actor in this equation knows that the longer the current configuration holds, the higher the probability that some unscripted incident, some miscalculation by a junior officer, or some unauthorized action by a proxy force transforms a managed confrontation into an unmanaged one. That is the knife edge on which the entire crisis is now balanced.